This is the second episode of a two-parter on Ecce Homo, but part one was months ago, and this is because we covered the essays in Ecce Homo, but not the reviews of Nietzsche's own books. And the reason for that is that I wanted to talk about Nietzsche's retrospective outlook on his career toward the end of the season, rather than the beginning. The end of this season is going to have that retrospective mood of planting ourselves at the end of Nietzsche's productive career and casting a glance backward, as it were. Ecce Homo was actually begun on October the 15th, 1888, which was Nietzsche's 44th birthday. He finished it in November of the same year, one of the 5 books that he completed in 1888. Like the Antichrist, Ecce Homo would not see publication for some time after his death, and its initial printing was only a limited run. But nevertheless, in spite of Ecce Homo arriving in an untimely fashion, we might say, Nietzsche showed a strange prescience in writing it, in the way he does and when he writes it, as if he knows that he's about to descend into madness any day now. And in spite of the fact that he still has this project of the revaluation of values, the potential for something he can work on many years into the future, because Antichrist is supposed to be volume 1 of what is planned originally as like a 4-volume work. In spite of the fact that Nietzsche has those plans, Ecce Homo reads like he's putting a capstone on the entirety of his career. I mean, really, the man just decides in 1888, a few months before he loses his mind and can't write anymore, maybe I should write a retrospective on my life and give an explanation of the background and the significance of each one of my books. It's the kind of thing that an author does at the end of a long, productive life when they're old and dying. And I suppose Nietzsche knew his condition could claim his life at any time. So maybe it wasn't such a big coincidence that he was, for once in his life, rather timely in writing it, even if it came out or was published in an untimely fashion. But in any case, just remarkably, we have this book in Nietzsche's own words summing up his life and career on his own terms in the final productive year of his life, is when he decides to write this. So it should be noted that the way Nietzsche views his own career is anything but objective. One can detect throughout this assessment of his own works a great importance attributed to the novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The work comes right in the middle of the main period of Nietzsche's writing, and it forms a sort of centerpiece, both chronologically and in terms of Nietzsche's own understanding. Everything before Zarathustra is seen as a lead-up to Zarathustra, and everything after Zarathustra is seen as a commentary on it. As Kaufman puts it, Ecce Homo, quote, contains all too many references to Zarathustra, most of them embarrassing, and the numerous long quotations from that book are almost rendered pointless by Zarathustra's great posthumous success. The quotations were intended for readers who did not know the book, end quote. It is true that Nietzsche oftentimes speaks of Zarathustra as a world-changing book, which, is not a false statement, but one which is embarrassing because, well, the king doesn't have to tell you that he is the king. You could put it like that. It would be better to let the significance of the work speak for itself, as it were. But that being said, no one has ever said that Nietzsche is bound by our modern ethos of humbling ourselves, speaking with self-deprecation. Nietzsche looks back to the philosophers of the Hellenic period, all of whom were proud. And Nietzsche writes with that same kind of almost unspeakable pride, the belief that his philosophical recasting of the world into the world as will to power, the teaching of eternal recurrence and the overman, that this will be the most momentous philosophical event in European history. And so Nietzsche, even just because he's speaking about his own works, that does not necessarily make him a reliable interpreter. We should rid ourselves of any prejudice that the author will be the most honest interpreter of their own work. In our retrospective interpretations of our own lives, our own past ideas and writings, we always bring with us the baggage of the present. And thoughts and experiences and opinions that we hold now can affect the way that we look back on how we were thinking at the time. But in spite of the fact that Nietzsche has these flaws, which should be recognized from the outset, Walter Kaufmann also has a fairly forceful argument for why his reviews of his own books remain valuable to us. So Kaufmann writes, quote, "While some of Nietzsche's self-interpretations are much less persuasive than others, all of them have several inestimable advantages over almost everything that passes as serious literature about him. He did not discuss any of his works without having read them carefully, more than once. Indeed, he did not discuss any without knowing all of them in the sequence in which they were written, and of course in the original. He also knew all of his letters, as well as his unpublished fragments and notes. He wrote about his oeuvre with singular penetration, wit, and style. Let us be specific. Do his comments on the birth of tragedy make sense? Very little written on that book is as illuminating, and most discussions of the book are dated by Nietzsche's own discussion, which long antedates them." End quote. So, there are two sides to this. Nietzsche has an advantage over all other possible commenters because he has an unrivaled grasp of the material. And so when it comes to a work like The Birth of Tragedy, whose contents are so opaque, especially to the non-Hellenist, and, Nietzsche's approach to understanding the Greek culture so bizarre in many ways, and many of the ideas there, even though they would survive into Nietzsche's later work and his later thought in some form, really shouldn't just be taken out of Birth of Tragedy. You shouldn't extract the Apollinian and the Dionysian as he understands them in Birth of Tragedy and just throw those ideas down into your interpretation of Nietzsche when he's writing Beyond Good and Evil or Twilight of the Idols. So this is sort of Kaufmann's complaint about many of the commenters at the time when Kaufmann's writing, who are reading Nietzsche without really comprehending the sequence in which the works were written, how the ideas relate to each other, background of the work, and so on. But it should be said that much of what Nietzsche says about, say, The Birth of Tragedy is perhaps more illuminating at the development of Nietzsche's thought, seen as proceeding toward that center point of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Is it an honest, serious attempt at contextualizing that book on its own terms? Not quite. It's really Nietzsche contextualizing that book insofar as it is his first foray into philosophy, this project which centers around the creation of this magnum opus of Zarathustra. Right? So in a way, it's the first prelude to Zarathustra. So in that way, what Ecce Homo actually gives us and why it remains an eternally valuable work is that it's valuable for understanding how Nietzsche saw himself and his own development retrospectively, and as a result of the fact that he's writing on his own work, it happens to be more valuable than most of the secondary literature, which is quite funny. And so with that, with an awareness of Nietzsche's prejudices and biases, but still with the understanding of the value of this work, we'll go through and survey the main points of what Nietzsche says about each of his books, which will also kind of serve as a chronological guide to each book. Maybe that'll be the value of this episode in the long term. So we'll begin with the section on The Birth of Tragedy, 1872. The first thing that Nietzsche says about The Birth of Tragedy is something indisputable in my view, that everything that made the book popular is exactly what was wrong with it. It's widely known that The Birth of Tragedy was regarded as a scholarly failure, but it was received very warmly by Wagner and his circle of followers. This Wagnerianism that runs throughout the book was the main source of controversy and the main source of interest, really, in The Birth of Tragedy. And Nietzsche admits this was its main fault. This is what mars the work in posterity. Another criticism that Nietzsche has is that the book could easily have appeared 50 years earlier. That would have been the year 1820, and that's the heyday of Schopenhauer and Hegel. And this is because The Birth of Tragedy is, quote, indifferent toward politics, un-German, to use the language of the present time. It smells offensively Hegelian, and the cadaverous perfume of Schopenhauer sticks only to a few formulas. An idea, the antithesis of the Dionysian, the Apollonian, translated into the realm of metaphysics, history itself as the development of this idea. In tragedy, this antithesis is sublimated into a unity, and in this perspective, things that had never before faced each other are suddenly juxtaposed, used to illuminate each other, and comprehended. Opera, for example, and the revolution, end quote. And that critical word about Birth of Tragedy is maybe the most informative thing that Nietzsche ever wrote about it. When he says that the antithesis between Dionysus and Apollo is sublimated into a unity, the German term is aufgehoben, which can mean canceled, preserved, and lifted up. That's a term often employed by Hegel. Nietzsche sees that idea as central to Birth of Tragedy. Apollo and Dionysus, the antithesis between them, and this idea as becoming metaphysical in its significance. The negative movement of the concept, the two art forces attempting to refute one another, results in the flowering of an underlying unity, which is the Greek tragedy. And while there are important ways in which this dichotomy would be developed in a non-Hegelian direction in Nietzsche's later work, Nietzsche's self-criticism here seems rather definitive. He admits that he was thinking in a Hegelian fashion when he wrote this work, and the Schopenhauerian view of the world as will, the glory of inactivity, of somehow subduing the will. This kind of pessimistic formulation, as he says, perfumes the whole work. But the most important aspect of Nietzsche's retrospective here, on Birth of Tragedy, is the recognition of that several key discoveries were made right here at the beginning of his career that would set the direction of his entire project. And those discoveries are, as he lists them here, the recognition of Socrates as a decadent, Socrates as a problem. To recognize Socrates, the moralist, as a symptom of a declining society. Nietzsche says it's a great leap of insight. That's the view of the 1888 Nietzsche, looking back on his earlier work, and he puts it succinctly here, quote, Socrates represents, quote, rationality against instinct, rationality at any price, as a dangerous force that undermines life, end quote. Next, another concept which Nietzsche says showed a great insight was the Dionysian. Nietzsche calls it that wonderful phenomenon, the only parable and parallel for his own inmost experience. We find the spirit of the Dionysian that he describes here in Twilight of Idols. Nietzsche quotes himself in the text of Ecce Homo, quote, saying yes to life even in its strangest and hardest problems, the will to life rejoicing over its own inexhaustibility even in the very sacrifice of its highest types, end quote. Nietzsche, who lived, physiologically speaking, a hard life, a life beset by sickliness, against which he had to struggle for every grain of health that he could claw away from his sickness. His innermost need is to say yes to this life, as he says here, to celebrate life as an inexhaustible force, call the sacrifices made in the name of life good. And the third major discovery is the perhaps implicit awareness of the way in which all so-called degenerative instinct always turns against itself and turns against life. And this is the origin of Schopenhauerianism, of Christianity, even of Platonism. So the three major discoveries that he says he makes in the course of writing Birth of Tragedy: Socrates, the moralist, as the symptom of a dying culture, morality thus as decadence; the Dionysian, the inner cultural life of the Greeks prior to Socrates, affirming life in all its hard and terrible cruelty; and the ascetic ideal, coming out of the Socratic moralism, becoming hostile to life. It's in this passage in Ecce Homo that Nietzsche says that his attitude towards Christianity in this period was characterized by a, quote, profound hostile silence, end quote. And even though he does not directly mention Christianity, the underlying perception existed even here at the beginning of Christianity as world-denying, and this world denial as a consequence of the moralistic worldview. That this moralistic worldview is something that emerges during the times of decline. There's a logic of development that's entirely prefigured within this very first text. There's this apparent dichotomy between Apollo and Dionysus. This dichotomy is not a true dichotomy, it's really a dialectic, perhaps one that's too Hegelian for later Nietzsche's taste. Meaning, it's not a true dichotomy because it's actually an underlying unity, two aspects of the force of art. The real dichotomy in the work is between art and science, between Aeschylus, Homer, Archilochus, and so on, the great poets and playwrights of the tragic age, against Socrates, the theoretician. And I would say that is the main struggle of the work, but there is on the horizon the outline, the silhouette of Nietzsche's later struggle against Christianity, that the theoretical view of life introduces moralism into the picture, moralism, idealism, this notion of an ideal world from the point of view of which our world is judged and condemned. That's the adumbration, the rough sketch of Christianity. So the real dichotomy is not yet fully articulated, Dionysus versus the crucified, but rather we have the first inkling of it, first hint of it in the first work. The chapter on Birth of Tragedy notably contains a lengthy digression on the topic of the Untimely meditations, namely the essay Richard Wagner and Bayreuth. So why does Nietzsche start talking about the last Untimely Meditations essay here in the section that's supposed to be about Birth of Tragedy? Well, because he wants to establish that Wagner's influence was not really Wagner's influence, but Nietzsche's use of Wagner's worldview, his use of the Wagnerian movement to express and carry his own inner truths. That is really the argument that Nietzsche makes, the interpretation, just as the figure of Wagner, as he appears in the essay Richard Wagner and Bayreuth, is not really Wagner, but he says Zarathustra, a prefiguration of Zarathustra. And Nietzsche says that, quote, "A psychologist might still add that what I heard as a young man listening to Wagnerian music had really nothing to do with Wagner, that when I described Dionysian music, I described what I had heard, that instinctively I had to transpose and transfigure everything into the new spirit that I carried with me," end quote. So at the time of writing, Nietzsche was enamored with Wagner and genuinely believed that the Dionysian music, the music of the future, was what characterized Wagner's project. But again, what's interesting in this retrospective that he gives to us in Ecce Homo is not so much that we're getting an accurate picture of what Nietzsche thought at the time of writing these works. It's how later Nietzsche came to understand and interpret his own history, his own biography. And psychologically, Nietzsche quite plainly says that what he was doing was projecting. Nietzsche says that what he sought after in Wagner was not actually the real Wagner, but perhaps the archetype of what he was seeking, as Jung would have put it, the wise man, the magician, the patriarch who anchors a new tradition of meaning. This was something that he read into Wagner, but which he would later create in Zarathustra as an archetype with, in Nietzsche's view, an archetype with real value. That, Wagner did not ultimately live up to the archetype of the wise man. He ultimately disappointed him. He was a magician, but in the sense of someone who does magic tricks. And I think this is a very self-aware way that Nietzsche has of contextualizing where he was at the time, and the way in which his worship of Wagner at the time, the influence of Schopenhauer on his thought at that time, these were simply manifestations of his own inner needs. That whatever we project onto others is revealing about ourselves. I think that's fair enough. And Nietzsche continues with this point in the next section on the Untimely Meditations, where he writes that the first such essay of that series, about David Strauss, was actually directed against German culture. Culture is in quotes. And the second, on the use and abuse of history for life, was an attempt to reveal what is dangerous in our trafficking in science and scholarship. But Nietzsche says that the final two are, quote, "two images of the hardest self-love, self-discipline, as pointers to a higher concept of culture, to restore the concept of culture. Untimely types, par excellence, full of sovereign contempt for everything around them that was called empire, culture, Christianity, Bismarck, success, Schopenhauer and Wagner, or, in one word, Nietzsche," end quote. So Schopenhauer and Wagner, Schopenhauer in the essay Schopenhauer as Educator, he's regarded in that essay as a hero or as the heroic type of man, the best way forward for the man of the modern age. And Wagner, in the essay Richard Wagner and Bayreuth, who's portrayed as the herald of a new kind of coming German culture. As Nietzsche said in the previous section, Wagner is just an early formulation for Zarathustra, a figure into which Nietzsche can pour his hopes. And as for Schopenhauer, Nietzsche writes, quote, "At bottom, it is admittedly not Schopenhauer as educator that speaks here, but his opposite, Nietzsche as educator." End quote. In short, the essay Schopenhauer as educator is a testament to the things that Nietzsche could learn from Schopenhauer, but one gets no more out of things, books included, than he already knows. And given the things he says about Schopenhauer in that essay, one can definitely see the way in which Nietzsche might have been reading a pessimism of strength into Schopenhauer's example, whereas later he would have said Schopenhauer's pessimism was a pessimism of weakness. It was resignationism, being resigned to to a pessimistic view of life. Perhaps we could say Nietzsche merely learned from Schopenhauer the pessimism of strength, even if Schopenhauer the man didn't actually possess it. The comments on the first two essays are amusing insofar as Nietzsche seems, above all, to relish the memory of the reception of the first essay, the one he wrote against David Strauss. The fact that it made ripples in German society, that it established Nietzsche's reputation as a polemicist. One commenter predicted that Nietzsche would have a great destiny solely on the basis of that work, that he would bring about, quote, "a kind of crisis, an ultimate decision in the problem of atheism, whose instinctive and relentless type he divined in me. It was atheism that led me to Schopenhauer," end quote. So, the essay's retrospective importance for Nietzsche is that, quite aside from the specifics of his disagreements with David Strauss, which admittedly are somewhat subtle, it showed Nietzsche's talent for fencing. He says it showed that he had a quick, supple wrist, like a good fencing master. This is another point of comparison between Nietzsche and Socrates. He uses the same language here that he used to describe Socrates in Twilight of Idols this same year as the greatest fencing master of Athens. Nietzsche says little to nothing about the use and abuse of history for life, which is odd, to me anyway, since it is the essay that perhaps contains the most fruitful ground for examining the development of Nietzsche's later ideas. Perhaps on that very basis, though, it deserves the least explanation with retrospect, right? It makes sense how the ideas in use and abuse could develop in the direction that later Nietzsche took them, whereas his disputes with Strauss, his admiration for Schopenhauer and Wagner, maybe Nietzsche anticipates those positions will be a little bit more perplexing to later audiences at a first glance, especially when one understands the serious differences that developed between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, or between Nietzsche and Wagner. That the old adage that only small minds discuss people is wrong in Nietzsche's view, by the way, because his relation to these figures, these other personalities, and what they come to represent, what they stand for, it dominates his attention in this section, over and above any discussion of the development of ideas. So Nietzsche must explain in retrospect the significance of his deference to these two characters. If these essays are not to be taken as indicative of the later Nietzsche's ideas, then does he wholly reject Schopenhauer and Wagner? Well, not exactly. He says that the essay on Schopenhauer is an encapsulation of his own past, his own history. And the essay on Wagner is a vision or a hope for his future. He projected that much onto these two different types because of the way that he used them in his writing. And ultimately, in retrospect, there is still great value in both of these figures as cases of psychological study. Nietzsche puts it best in part 3 of this section, quote, "Broadly speaking, I caught hold of two famous and yet altogether undiagnosed types, as one catches hold of an opportunity in order to say something, in order to have at hand a few more formulas, signs, means of language. This is really suggested with a perfectly uncanny sagacity near the end of section 7 in Schopenhauer as Educator, Plato employed Socrates in this fashion as a sign language for Plato. End quote. And I personally find that is very useful to understand a type, a figure, in a new and intimate way, and then to use that figure to speak for something, for some value or some ideal, to be the voice of something. And so it adds to your semiology, your lexicon of signs and gestures to communicate something. And Nietzsche's allegation is that Socrates is merely one of those, part of that sign language for Plato, which I love. This chapter on human all too human found in Ecce Homo is particularly fascinating. Nietzsche takes the time to situate the origins of the book in history during the Bayreuth Festival of 1876. He says that his intention in writing was not to break with Wagner, but nevertheless it was written at a time when he had begun to feel alienated from him. Wagner had spent years building the opera house in Bayreuth, preparing for the inaugural festival, which would bring together his movement of Wagnerians, and Nietzsche as part of Wagner's inner circle, and at one time hopeful that he would serve as a kind of philosophical interpreter of Wagner's musical vision. He says when that day finally came, the long-awaited gathering of Wagnerians, he felt estranged. And as for why, he writes, quote, Wagner had been translated into German. The Wagnerian had become master over Wagner. German art, the German master, German beer, end quote. In short, whatever greatness Wagner may have had, his followers were German nationalists, cultural chauvinists, Lutherans, men with rural, populist sensibilities. Wagner became captured by that audience. And Nietzsche says, by the time of the fest, he scarcely recognized the man. He thinks of his days spent with the Wagners at their home in Tribschen on Lake Lucerne. He calls Tribschen a distant isle of the blessed, that bore not a trace of similarity with the loud, obnoxious Germanness of the Bayreuth Festival. And so he retreated, sending Wagner only a vague telegram, leaving the fest halfway through, and he went to a small town in the woods of the Böhmerwald and wrote notes under a title, The Plowshare, the content of which comprises about a third of Human All Too Human. And as for what he wrote, he says that he went about, quote, with a torch whose light never wavers. An incisive light is thrown into this underworld of the ideal. This is war, but war without powder and smoke, end quote. Indeed, Human All Too Human does not really have the warlike tone of Nietzsche's later works. He acknowledges here his debt to Voltaire, to whom he dedicated the work, releasing it on the 100th anniversary of Voltaire's death. Voltaire, the cool-headed, rationalistic nobleman of France. That's Nietzsche's guide in writing this. This is a man who did not make war on ideals, but merely, as he says here, put them on ice. He says that he did so with the genius, the hero, faith, conviction, pity, the thing in itself. And I would add to that list free will, vanity, selflessness, universalism. He says that when exposed to the light, when put on ice, such ideals as all of these freeze to death. As for his motivations, Nietzsche says he came to recognize in the aftermath of that festival that his life up to this point had not aided him in completing what he calls his great task. Again, this is Nietzsche looking at this period in his life with the eyes of posterity, but he says of his scholarly career up to that point, quote, 10 years lay behind me in which the nourishment of my spirit had really come to a stop. I had not learned anything new that was useful. I had forgotten an absurd amount for the sake of dusty scholarly gewgaws. End quote. And I think that personal experience really colors so much of the way Nietzsche thinks about scholars in academia. It was actually a time where he learned nothing, nothing useful, as he says, nothing he can really integrate into his life. It was also during this time that Nietzsche's sickness worsened. These are the years that led up to Nietzsche's resignation from the university and his search for an ideal climate in which he could thrive in spite of his condition. In the years that followed, Nietzsche would explore various cures and search for any road back to health that he could find. But he is, in these passages, in Ecce Homo, grateful to his illness for the opportunity that it created, in some sense. What he felt he needed was to leave his life up to that point, which had stalled out. His philological work was merely that of an academic. His Wagnerian aspirations had been wasted on a man who turned out to be merely an actor, enthralled by his crowd of small-minded, good Germans but bad Europeans. So Nietzsche writes, quote, "My sickness gave me the right to change all my habits completely. It permitted, it commanded me to forget. It bestowed in me the necessity of lying still, of leisure, of waiting and being patient. But by that means, of thinking," end quote. And he goes on to write, on account of his bad eyesight, he was forcibly saved from reading books that were ultimately of no consequence in his creation of his great project, his life's work. And so Nietzsche makes the shocking claim, quote, "Never have I felt happier with myself than in the sickest and most painful periods of my life. One only need look at the dawn, or perhaps the wanderer and his shadow, to comprehend what this return to myself meant, a supreme kind of recovery." End quote. The value of his sickness is that it is a convalescence. And it's worth noting that in the years leading up to Ecce Homo, Nietzsche wrote new prefaces and new sections for these works of the middle period, which that includes all the volumes of Human All Too Human, then The Dawn, and then through to The Gay Science. And the theme in all of these new prefaces is convalescence. These works should be understood as a period of being both physically and psychologically sick, and that over the course of writing them, Nietzsche is getting well. And that in some sense, the act of writing them is his way of getting well. He says that every word in Human All Too Human, every sentence is a small victory, a small step toward health. And this is a wonderful way of contextualizing past works with which you don't fully identify anymore, or which you recognize the flaws of now, or the contradictions with maybe your current, more developed thought. And any thinker could benefit from this sort of way of reframing, or way of thinking about past works, which we might regard as an embarrassment or something like that. No, Nietzsche says they're to be understood as part of a process of getting well, of attaining health. It's during this time that a very important figure comes into Nietzsche's life, Heinrich Koselleck, or as Nietzsche calls him here, Peter Gast. Gast, a composer and a student at Basel, was very devoted to Nietzsche, and he says that he merely dictated the book while Gast committed it to writing, corrected it, arranged it, while Nietzsche lay there in pain with his head bandaged. Gast would go on to help Nietzsche in this manner to greater and lesser degrees throughout his productive career. And so for whatever faults he himself had, Peter Gast later collaborated with Elizabeth Nietzsche to attempt to distort or present Nietzsche's philosophy in a certain way that was not, we'll just say, not completely commensurate with Nietzsche's own vision. But it must be said, we would likely not have any books by Nietzsche, any philosophy books, if Peter Gast hadn't been around to be the stenographer for Nietzsche's thought, the Eckermann to Nietzsche's Goethe. Nietzsche describes his next major work, The Dawn. He says it's the book in which his campaign against morality is launched. It was written in Genoa and in the Alps. In keeping with his claim that he was happiest at his sickliest moments, Nietzsche says that his attacks here are still carried out in a kind of pleasant, upbeat spirit. The book is a cannon shot, but it nevertheless contains, quote, "no negative word, no attack, no spite. It lies in the sun, sound, happy, like some sea animal basking among rocks," end quote. Calls it, accordingly, a yes-saying book. Nietzsche's campaign against morality is a campaign that he describes in terms of digging beneath the foundations of morality and exposing them. He said in the preface of The Dawn, it's the work of a subterranean man, digging, undermining. The Dawn concerns itself extensively with the morality of the priest. The ascetic ideal is therefore first touched here in this work, and Nietzsche also criticizes biblical exegesis, Nietzsche's retrospective understanding of the significance of this whole mode of attack, is that it's the first step in preparing a moment of the, quote, highest self-examination for humanity. A great noon, when it looks back and far forward, when it emerges from the dominion of accidents and priests, and for the first time poses as a whole the question of why and for what. End quote. The operating method of the dawn is to translate the figure of the priest, of the saint, back into reality. Supposing that these figures are not divinely inspired, rightful moral guides of the community, what is their actual origin? What is the origin that we find in physical reality? Well, Nietzsche says, we have suppressed the pitiful truth that the saints are the slanderers of the world, the violators of men, that we have been governed by the craftily vengeful type of man. This is the origin of the priest's power over the human heart. Quote, the morality of decadence, the will to the end, has become accepted as morality itself. What is unegoistic is everywhere assigned absolute value, while what is egoistic is met with hostility. End quote. So those are the values that the priest represents and that he spreads in the community like an infection. The origin of these values is physiological, a dying society or culture, just as a dying individual begins to incline towards passivity, develops intellectual tendencies in which they will for the end. The priest as Brahmin, as the ruling caste of society, is a symptom of this kind of nihilism. That of nihilism rising to the top, the will to nothingness becoming the chief will in society. So Nietzsche writes here, quote, the priest desires precisely the degeneration of the whole, of humanity. For that reason, he conserves what degenerates. At this price, he rules. End quote. This is a kind of cultural sickness, but because we have books like the Bible that tell us that these saints have been the shepherds of mankind and the moral paradigm that we should follow, this reality has been distorted and obscured. And until the accident of history, that the type that wills nothingness ought to be the moral paradigm, until that accident is superseded by an understanding of history, a clear-headed, sober, serious attempt of the intellect to ask, why? What is life for? What is the point of a human life? Until that question is asked sincerely and honestly, until somebody undertakes a campaign to get to the bottom of this, as Nietzsche does, the great task for humanity cannot even be begun. And so that is his understanding of what he begins in The Dawn. Now Nietzsche says, if The Dawn was a yes-saying book, this is true in an even higher degree of the Gaia Scientia. Quote, in almost every sentence, profundity and high spirits go tenderly hand in hand. End quote. But other than this general sentiment, Nietzsche's thoughts in Ecce Homo on the gay science, they're mostly non-existent. To the extent that he ties it to a particular period in his life, he references the January on which he wrote Book 4 of the Gay Science, the most profound and joyous month of January that he says he'd ever experienced. The book is dedicated to St. Januarius, whose relic, a vial of dried blood that's held in a certain chapel, becomes liquid again on his feast day. And so Nietzsche employs this metaphor, his own blood has become liquid again. The Gay Science is the book which represents the completion of his convalescence. And even though his bouts of illness would continue, it was around this time that he found his ideal climate in Sils Maria, his ideal environment for his physical and mental health. And it was here that he'd felt he'd overcome those past prejudices and past ideological commitments. So instead of the ideas of the Gay Science, he prefers to talk about the poems included in the work. For the majority of the short section in Ecce Homo that's devoted to the Gay Science, he talks about the poems. The ideas of the Gay Science, and he actually just reproduces the poem. The ideas, we could say, are found also in Zarathustra. Maybe that's Nietzsche's thinking, that the Gay Science states as a sort of, again, a prelude, many of the ideas that he would say gained their full expression in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and are elaborated upon in Beyond Good and Evil. And, you could say that the themes of the Gay Science don't vary that much from the themes that characterize Nietzsche's so-called mature philosophy. So maybe he thought they don't require very much explanation. His sole focus in the page and a half in which he discusses this very important work of his seems to be his mood, his mindset, The fact that he feels, even in retrospect, the work is totally in the spirit of the provincial troubadours. Troubadours being, singer, knight, poet, first example of the free spirit. The fact that the section on the gay science is so short and the section on Thus Spoke Zarathustra is so long, I think helps to explain Kaufman's remarks that Nietzsche is not being entirely objective in his interpretation of his own career. Nietzsche gives outsized importance to Zarathustra. He gives less attention than is deserved to many of his other works, maybe as a consequence of that outsized importance. And so I wonder if perhaps, knowing that Thus Spoke Zarathustra was the next work he was to chronologically discuss in this text, maybe Nietzsche got a little excited to talk about his magnum opus and just sort of rushed through his analysis of the gay science. So, and we have to keep in mind, there is a narrative here that Nietzsche is giving us of the development of his philosophy. And so all the key points that he's tried to convey about the middle period are, well, for one, these are the record of my journey to health. He's already more or less established that. Two, here are the ways in which important prefigurations of my later ideas appeared. And by the time we get to the gay science, those major ideas have now appeared. So he'd rather discuss those in light of Zarathustra. So now we'll consider the longest chapter, the one on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Famously, Nietzsche begins with the suggestion that the idea of the eternal recurrence is the central idea of the work, and that this idea struck him while he was walking through the woods near Lake Silvaplana, one day in August of 1881, quote, 6,000 feet beyond man and time, end quote. Now, of course, Nietzsche wrote about that idea first in The Gay Science, and the original conclusion to The Gay Science was the first part of Zarathustra's prologue. As he notes here, the final aphorism of its fourth book, which was the final book of The Gay Science at the time of publication, that's the scene of Zarathustra greeting the sun, declaring his intentions to go down and give his wisdom to humanity. Nietzsche also notes that in 1883, Wagner died, and in the 18 months that followed, Zarathustra gestated within him. And though he was long estranged from the Wagners by this time, perhaps there was something liberating about the knowledge that his old mentor and his old father figure had passed on. Nietzsche is now totally free to embark on his great task. Perhaps from a psychological standpoint, Zarathustra could only emerge to fulfill the archetype of the wise king when the old wise king was laid in the grave. And so perhaps this gives credence to the Jungian interpretation that Zarathustra possessed Nietzsche. And Nietzsche writes that Zarathustra as a type, quote, overtook me, end quote. Nietzsche then takes up a whole section of this chapter, quoting from Book 5 of The Gay Science to describe Zarathustra's type, which it should be noted was added later. The whole book, Book 5 of The Gay Science, was added later, only a couple years before writing this in Ecce Homo. So Nietzsche quotes the great health, which is the name for the thing he'd been trying to attain for years and years during his middle period, his search for convalescence. In that passage in The Gay Science, he describes it as something, the great health is something that one does not merely have, it's something that one acquires continually, and that you have to continually give up again and again. So it's a very living, moving metaphor. The metaphors he uses are those of explorers, people who have suffered shipwreck and hardship. He says those who have become, quote, dangerously healthy, end quote. It's also worth noting that Zarathustra, in a few chapters of that work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is himself a convalescent. In Zarathustra, we have the image of convalescence, the image of attaining the ideal of the great health. Wherever we find an ideal, we find a deficiency. And so Zarathustra is Nietzsche's ideal, the avatar of the greatest health, the greatest love of life and embrace of all the hardest challenges of life. That should indicate to us, according to Nietzsche's own logic, the sickliness of Nietzsche, his attempt to escape from his own psychological faults and dependencies. He allows himself to be overtaken by this figure of Zarathustra as a form of cure for his illness. Zarathustra is a product. This image of health is a product of Nietzsche's sickness. And he describes this in the same language Socrates uses to describe the inspiration of the poets. Quote, If one had the slightest residue of superstition left in one's system, one could hardly reject altogether the idea that one is merely incarnation, merely mouthpiece, merely a medium of overpowering forces. End quote. In Socrates' description of how the divine possession by the Muses works, this is undoubtedly a bad and dangerous thing. But Nietzsche definitely stands more in the camp with the poets and the rhapsodes on this particular question. He says that the thoughts of Zarathustra flashed into his mind like lightning. Quote, "I never had any choice." End quote. Again, it's not something he complains about, but something that he affirms. Nietzsche writes that in this seizure of himself by his muse, Zarathustra, as in all involuntary happenings, there was a feeling of freedom, of absoluteness, of power, of divinity. This is one of those wonderful Nietzschean oxymoronic statements, as Dr. Michael Sugrue used to talk about. The highest feeling of freedom is naturally found in the most involuntary happenings. Now, of course, so far, Nietzsche has only described the circumstances that formed the background of Zarathustra's beginnings. But Zarathustra was written in 4 parts, and these various parts express different moods, different states of Zarathustra's soul, and these are reflective of Nietzsche's life at the time. Shortly after beginning the work, he falls ill in Genoa. Then he spent some time in Rome, which he sort of resents. He says that his time in Rome was characterized by an indescribable melancholy, a feeling of isolation whilst among the throngs of the faithful. In the hustle and bustle of this great holy city, he feels absolutely alone. After this, he writes Zarathustra II in the following summer, reportedly in only 10 days. Then, the next winter, Zarathustra III. The 4th part is written the following year, though the last part initially had a very limited publication and was only distributed to a few close friends. And as if to prove that the great health is something one gains and then loses again periodically, Nietzsche reports that, quote, "The years during and above all after my Zarathustra are marked by distress without equal. One pays dearly for immortality. One has to die several times while still alive." End quote. The way that Nietzsche writes about the completion of Zarathustra, he describes it like he had to give a part of his soul in order to write it. Like he bled himself dry. He felt deflated, empty afterwards. That by writing it, he'd become weak. And, sometimes he uses the language of pregnancy and giving birth, but I think of the retirement syndrome we're all familiar with, that people die after retirement, after their purpose has been fulfilled. And that Nietzsche perhaps felt, okay, I did it. This is my great work. What now? I've given everything I have to this work. But what follows is not happiness, it's discontent, a feeling of apartness from all around him. He says he even experiences physiological symptoms of this. After Zarathustra, he digested less well. He did not like to move. He felt chills as well as mistrust. And there's something of a longing for the warmth that is part of the herd's existence. This is the metaphor Nietzsche often uses for solitude, intellectual solitude, immoralist philosophy, wandering beyond the protection of the collective with its huddling together for warmth. You're wandering up into the cold high mountains. Perhaps some of what Kaufmann considers embarrassing is Nietzsche's claim that there's nothing in history that compares with Zarathustra. He says that it is above and beyond the capabilities of Goethe, of Shakespeare, that Dante, he's merely a believer in comparison, not one who creates truth. The priests and poets of the Vedas are not fit to fasten Zarathustra's sandals. He says that, quote, "Let anyone add up the spirit and good nature of all great souls. All of them together would not be capable of producing even one of Zarathustra's discourses." End quote. If we take Nietzsche seriously, that he was only the mouthpiece, these statements might not even be arrogant, megalomaniacal as they may seem. Nietzsche perhaps truly believed that he was being struck with a kind of profound inspiration that is more, it's not something that comes out of his own power, it's like a vision from the god Apollo, sparking at his laurel. And how could Goethe or Shakespeare compete with that? In this chapter, Nietzsche also claims to be the inventor of the dithyramb, and one wonders whether he's perhaps using Emersonian language here. Claiming the same underlying inspiration. It flowed through me just as it flowed through the dithyrambic poets of old. The dithyramb belongs to me just as much as to them. Either that or he's just aggrandizing himself beyond all belief. It's worth noting, however, that the great virtue of Zarathustra, the exemplification of the Dionysian that he represents, is a kind of supreme charity. Nietzsche writes, quote, "How gently he handles even his antagonists, the priests, and suffers of them with them. Here man has been overcome at every moment. The concept of the overman has become the greatest reality." End quote. As Nietzsche writes elsewhere, light feet is a sign of divinity, and everything about Zarathustra is light. He is playful, he is leaping, he is dancing, he's the refutation of the spirit of gravity. Zarathustra has a kind of seriousness, kind of great seriousness, that is the opposite of grave seriousness. It's a playful seriousness almost. Above all, a desire to spread innocence and happiness, redeem the world into innocence, even in the strangest, hardest, most wicked matters. This is the image of the overman achieving its greatest reality. This is the overcoming of man. The overcoming of gravity, or the overcoming of the spirit of revenge, of dealing with one's enemies by means of guilt and recrimination and condemnation. Zarathustra represents the overcoming of that, but he himself condemns nothing. And so, in spite of Nietzsche's boundless pride in these passages, it's significant the way that he heaps his own praises not upon himself but upon Zarathustra as a sort of autonomous, separate entity from himself. And, he says that this life affirmation that we find in Zarathustra is the, quote, "the tremendous unbounded saying yes and amen," end quote. That's the great gift that Zarathustra gives. Now, we move on to Beyond Good and Evil, written in 1885 and 1886. And this is the beginning of a new period of Nietzsche's writing, what we might call a critical period. And notice how, throughout the main period of his career, Nietzsche has thus far described every entry as a sort of crescendo of his affirmative philosophy. Every book is positive, every book is a yes-saying book. Even his critical beginnings in Human All Too Human and The Dawn. Nietzsche understands these as his way of liberating himself, as part of his convalescence struggle towards freedom, and so as books that are ultimately positive, warm, yes-saying in their way. They're proceeding towards life. He's not making war in these books as he did in the Untimely Meditations. But then, in the somewhat bleak period following the completion of this task, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's thought turns and his taste changes. Quote, "After the yes-saying part of my task had been solved, the turn had come for the no-saying, the no-doing part, the revaluation of values so far, the great war, conjuring up a day of decision. This included the slow search for those related to me, those who, prompted by strength, would offer me their hands for destroying." End quote. And thus, Nietzsche describes Beyond Good and Evil as critique. It is an attack on modernity. Unlike Zarathustra, who deals with his enemies gently, even suffers with them, Beyond Good and Evil is a return to the fencing thrusts of Nietzsche's earlier days. But now, having effected his revaluation, his project of absolute life affirmation, the likes of which he has just argued have never before been seen on Earth, well, now the ground must be cleared for this revaluation to take root. This involves an attack on all those prejudices of modern sciences, the modern arts, modern politics. Nietzsche writes that where in Zarathustra he wrote from the perspective of one far-seeing, in Beyond Good and Evil he was forced to, quote, "focus on what lies nearest, the age, the around us," end quote. Nietzsche counterposes the master morality against the modern morality. Really, in the first comprehensive way, this happens in Beyond Good and Evil. This is the work where the terms master and slave morality are introduced. But notice, the master morality becomes relevant to Nietzsche, most relevant, during this no-saying period. the master morality, the antica morale, the morality of antiquity, is a way of making war on the modern. In some sense, it is a way of exposing the modern so that one could even know what it is and what it represents by contrasting it and thus making both images sharper, clearer. So in this work of biting critique, in which Nietzsche begins by going after the major philosophical concepts and figures of Western philosophy, psychoanalyzing the religious mindset, deconstructing the scholarly approach to life, and so on and so forth, it concludes with this chapter, What is Noble, in which Nietzsche more or less creates an image of this type, the perspective that is native to classical antiquity. Why does Nietzsche do this? Because, quote, all those things of which our age is proud are experienced as contradictions to this type, almost as bad manners. Our famous objectivity, for example, pity for all that suffers, the historical sense with its submission to foreign tastes, groveling on its belly before trivial facts, and being scientific. End quote. So the master morality type is useful to Nietzsche in this no-saying work that comes as what he calls a squandering of the good-naturedness of Zarathustra. That in recuperation from the completion of that project, he found it useful to turn to critique, to turn to attack. He then comes up with a blasphemous reinterpretation of the Genesis story at the end of the chapter on Beyond Good and Evil as a way of summing up that work's place in his life. Quote, it was God himself who at the end of his day's work laid down as a serpent under the tree of knowledge. Thus he recuperated from being God. He had made everything too beautiful. The devil is merely the leisure of God on his seventh day. End quote. So that is Beyond Good and Evil's significance, told in a parable. That Nietzsche, having created a worldview that was almost too beautiful, having played at being God, and having raised mountain ranges, having created a new world, a world as will to power, having given man a new Messiah even, the Overman, having preached the good news, the gospel of the eternal return. Now Nietzsche will play at being the accuser, changing masks, changing roles, common theme in pagan ritual and storytelling, and he'll become the tempter, the destroyer, the experimenter. The point in Beyond Good and Evil is not to construct anything. That work has already been completed. The point is pure critique, pure destruction. And how is it that Nietzsche then describes his next work, the Genealogy of Morals? The subtitle, of course, is a polemic. So once again, this is a rather short chapter in Ecce Homo, and while Nietzsche does not delve much in this chapter into explaining why the genealogy should be understood first and foremost as a polemic, he actually tells us right out in that book his target is Paul Rée and his book on the history of moral feelings. Nietzsche insists he has held these ideas for a very long time, and he developed them in The Dawn and Human Ultra Human, but that Rée's work, his attempt to give a total account of the origins of morality, spurred Nietzsche on to give his own comprehensive picture. And this is because Rée's work is one that Nietzsche finds staunch disagreement with, and more broadly, that Nietzsche disagrees with the entire methodology that has been followed up to this point in order to determine the origins of morality. Just the whole thinking about morality and the way in which that colors the way that we think about it, the origins of morality is colored by our moral positions. So we think about the origin of morality in a moralistic way. That's really what I'm getting at. So Nietzsche writes in the preface to the Genealogy of Morals, quote, if in this context I thought amongst others of the aforesaid Dr. Rée, I did so because I had no doubt that from the very nature of his questions he would be compelled to have recourse to a truer method in order to obtain his answers. Have I deceived myself on that score? I wished at all events to give a better direction of vision to an eye of such keenness and such impartiality. I wished to direct him to the real history of morality, and to warn him, while there was yet time, against a world of English theories that culminated in the blue vacuum of heaven. End quote. And then, in the main text of the genealogy, Nietzsche writes in Essay 1, Section 2, quote, the whole train of their thought runs, as was always the way of old-fashioned philosophers, on thoroughly unhistorical lines. There is no doubt on this point. Crass ineptitude of their genealogy of morals is immediately apparent when the question arises of ascertaining the origin of the idea and judgment of good. Man had originally, so speaks their decree, praised and called good altruistic acts from the standpoint of those on whom they were conferred, that is, those to whom they were useful. Subsequently, the origin of this praise was forgotten, and altruistic acts, simply because, as a sheer matter of habit, they were praised as good, came also to be felt as good, as though they contained in themselves some intrinsic goodness. This initial derivation contains already all the typical and idiosyncratic traits of the English psychologists. End quote. So the reason why I wanted to jump into that chapter in Genealogy of Morality, kind of move away from this chapter in Ecce Homo and briefly look into that work that he's talking about here, is because Nietzsche doesn't really elaborate on the point in Ecce Homo, but it's worthwhile to understand that the genealogy is a further development within that critical no-saying period. That this polemic is targeted against something, that the genealogy ought to be contextualized as a long argument against the position here attributed to the English psychologists who believe that good acts are ultimately altruistic acts, and that they came to be regarded as good owing to their utility. And such an account of morality would mean that morality is a sort of evolutionary advantage that we've developed, that we created more moral values as a useful tool, that it became then ingrained as a matter of habit. The lines of Nietzsche's attack on this erroneous view are those based on history and in his background as a philologist, because first and foremost, Nietzsche's argument is this is simply an anachronistic viewpoint of how the early human societies conceived of the good. Nietzsche knew this from his study of the Greeks. Usefulness, utility, altruism, and so on. These simply were not factored into the Greek conception of the good. And selflessness, selfless duty, would have been a foreign concept to the Greeks as well. Nothing could have been further from their minds. Meanwhile, lurking beneath our apparent altruism in the modern age is not just a useful character trait that was positively selected for by the community. Beneath it is a Christian valuation that makes the charitable, kind, harmless person into the good. This valuation, as Nietzsche argues in the Genealogy, doesn't arise out of being selected for on the basis of utility. As a historical fact, it arises as a kind of revenge on the good of the Hellenic Greek aristocrat and later the Roman pagan aristocrat. A condemnation of their good, rather than indicating an actually selfless driver of action or a utilitarian selective principle at work in the human species. It reveals the spirit of revenge. That entire claim that Nietzsche puts forward in Genealogy of Morality is a polemic against that idea of English psychologizing about morality, which ultimately just takes our modern prejudices, our modern morality, and rolls it into our understanding of how morality came about. And so Nietzsche writes in Ecce Homo, quote, "The truth of the first inquiry is the birth of Christianity out of the spirit of ressentiment, not, as people may believe, out of the spirit, a counter-movement by its very nature, a great rebellion against the dominion of noble values." End quote. As for what Nietzsche has to say about the next two essays, well, they're also polemical in nature. The second, on guilt and bad conscience, as Nietzsche indicates in Ecce Homo, is a polemic against the notion that one's conscience is, quote, the voice of God in man, end quote. Instead, Nietzsche argues, it is, quote, the instinct of cruelty that turns back after it can no longer discharge itself externally. Cruelty is here exposed for the first time as one of the most ancient and basic substrata of culture that simply cannot be imagined away. End quote. The final piece of this polemic, the third act, is an attack on the aesthetic ideal. This is to pick up on the same themes that Nietzsche indicates were first sketched out in the Dawn. He revisits that theme here with a method that is not merely to expose the priestly ideal, not merely to put it on ice, as it were, but to truly challenge it in a critical manner, truly make war on it. And as such, Nietzsche concludes his retrospective on the genealogy here in Ecce Homo by declaring, quote, this book contains the first psychology of the priest, end quote. But it is perhaps time that we cease in using the language of retrospection, considering Nietzsche's comments on the final two books in this chronology, namely Twilight of Idols in the case of Wagner, because these are written in the same year as Ecce Homo, so they're not really retrospectives anymore. And in the chapter on Twilight of Idols, Nietzsche gives us, therefore, a contemporaneous account of his state of mind in 1888. He gives us a suggestion of the creative storm in which he worked, mentioning that no sooner had he finished Twilight of the Idols did he begin writing the Antichrist, the planned first volume of the new opus, The Transvaluation of Values. But I want to read at length from section 3 of this chapter in Ecce Homo, section 3 on the part of about Twilight of Idols, and the description that Nietzsche gives of the events of his life at this time. Quote, "Immediately after the completion of the above-named work, and without letting even one day go by, I tackled the formidable task of the transvaluation with a supreme feeling of pride which nothing could equal. And, certain at each moment of my immortality, I cut sign after sign upon tablets of brass with the sureness of fate. The preface came into being on 3rd September 1888. When, after having written it down, I went out into the open that morning, I was greeted by the most beautiful day I had ever seen in the Upper Engadine. Clear, glowing with color, presenting all the contrasts and all the intermediary gradations between ice and the south. I left Sils Maria only on the 20th of September. I had been forced to delay my departure owing to floods, and for some days the only visitor in this wonderful spot on which my gratitude bestows the gift of an immortal name. After a journey that was full of incidents and not without danger to life, as for instance at Como, which was flooded when I reached it in the dead of night, I got to Turin on the afternoon of the 21st. Turin is the only suitable place for me, and it shall be my home henceforward. I took the same lodging as I had occupied in the spring, 6 Via Carlo Alberto, on the 4th floor, opposite the mighty Palazzo Carignano, in which Vittorio Emanuele was born, and I had a view of the Piazza Carlo Alberto and above it across to the hills. Without hesitating or allowing myself to be disturbed for a single moment, I returned to my work, only the last quarter of which still had to be written. On the 30th September, tremendous triumph, the 7th day, the leisure of a god on the banks of the Po. On the same day, I wrote the preface to the Twilight of the Idols, the correction of the proofs of which provided me with recreation during the month of September. Never in my life have I experienced such an autumn, nor had I ever imagined that such things were possible on earth. A Claude Lorraine extended to infinity, each day equal to the last in its wild perfection." End quote. So it seems that, in spite of the central importance that he's attributed to Zarathustra, Nietzsche is in a sort of ecstatic mood, gearing up for another grand project. And we might wonder if the Transvaluation of Values might have been the crescendo of the no-saying period of Nietzsche, the complete annihilation of all the current modern values, the complete harnessing of the will to nothingness as a destructive force against the nihilism of modern times. Because it should be noted, even though this is a joyous, creative period, this rich autumn in which, quote, "a great wind blows among trees and everywhere fruit falls down," end quote. Twilight of Idols is decidedly a critical work. Nietzsche says that no ideal remains untouched by this work, the ideals being synonymous with idols, before which, Nietzsche says, he puts on his gloves. He describes Twilight of the Idols as cheerful and ominous, quote, "a demon that laughs," end quote. And perhaps he gives us some indication of where that kind of jesting devil comes from when he references Goethe's Faust, by saying that he traveled on a crooked path, an askew path, which was henceforth called truth. He followed the will down this askew, crooked path, akin to following a darkling aspiration, because precisely the good man is least aware of the right path. This is all language from the prologue in Heaven in Goethe's play. The significance of the Twilight of Idols for Nietzsche is that in this short volume, he has assembled a primer, a handbook of critiques against all modern ideals, and Nietzsche describes this critical book as nevertheless a book of glad tidings. The final chapter of Nietzsche's auto-reviews of his books is on the case of Wagner. And obviously, we're revisiting Nietzsche's old mentor, the now deceased Richard Wagner. Reflections on his relationship with Wagner have been sown throughout this chronological account, and the retrospective makes Wagner the fulcrum of so many significant events in Nietzsche's life. So, of course, he has to cap off the discussion by reviewing his final word on Wagner. And Nietzsche says, perhaps surprisingly, "I have loved Wagner." As he mentioned earlier in the book, his memories with the Wagners are still among his fondest. He asks, quote, "Does anyone really doubt that I, as the old artillerist I am, could easily bring up my heavy guns against Wagner?" End quote. And he says that even more than an attack on Wagner, his polemics toward his old mentor were an attack on, quote, "a German nation which is becoming ever lazier and more impoverished in its instincts, gobbling down without any digestive troubles faith as well as scientific manners, Christian love as well as anti-Semitism, the will to the Reich as well as the gospel of the humble." End quote. That's the crowd that captured Wagner's soul. And Nietzsche's antipathy towards Wagner has always been mixed in with his antipathy towards German culture, towards German taste. Nietzsche writes, quote, "German has become an argument. Deutschland über alles a principle. The Teutons represent a moral world order in history. There is now a historiography that is Reichsdeutsch. There is even, I fear, an anti-Semitic one." End quote. And Nietzsche here repeats his long-standing critique of the Germans, which is also found in the Antichrist and in his Nachlass, that the Germans destroyed the age of the Renaissance, that Luther in his Reformation represented a Germanic moral rebirth. And, in fact, as Kaufman notes, much of this section, written around the same time as the Antichrist, it repeats many of the same sentences that are included there in Antichrist 61. It's almost exactly the same passage. But it's notable that Nietzsche includes it here to further establish what he means, what he signifies by Germany, and what his problem with Germany really is. Quote, "When an honest, unequivocal, perfectly scientific way of thinking had just been attained with tremendous fortitude and self-overcoming, the Germans managed to find devious paths to the old ideal." End quote. And he lists Leibniz as an example of this, and Kant as an example. Both halt the progress to the self-overcoming, the natural transvaluation that was, in Nietzsche's view, in full swing in the Renaissance, and they attempt to drag Europe back to religion. Nietzsche earlier argued that the philosopher is another guise for the priest, or has occupied that role throughout history, and German philosophy exemplifies this. In German philosophy, Nietzsche sees what he calls veil-making, clouding over the truth, a lack of honesty even. We might think of the way in which Nietzsche accused Plato of dishonesty, of cowardice in the face of reality. He suggests that Germany could have used a century of hard self-examination, as the French had in the 17th century. That Descartes and La Rochefoucauld were 100 times more honest than the foremost German philosophers. Quote, "Might I propose the word German as an international coinage for psychological depravity?" End quote. And so in this analysis of the case of Wagner, Nietzsche spends almost the whole thing going after the Germans again. Nietzsche says that whenever he tries to imagine a type that antagonizes all his instincts, the type always turns into a German. Germans are that kind of symbol for Nietzsche. The symbol of cultural Philistinism, dishonesty, a hodgepodge of incoherent ideas, unified under a holy lie. And tellingly, one of the only Germans he actually speaks of in praiseworthy terms in this whole chapter is Wagner. Quote, "Except for my association with a few artists, above all with Richard Wagner, I have not spent one good hour with a German." End quote. And so in this analysis of his last work about Wagner, which is a very critical work, Nietzsche tells us it's really about the Germans. It's really about the German Wagnerians. That's who I have a problem with. Perhaps their worst crime is the way that they ruined Wagner. It's not as if Wagner is without blame for this. I mean, he let himself be ruined. He was above all an actor, a magician, a cult of personality. But his crime, as Nietzsche tells us elsewhere, is that he became Reichsdeutsch. The Reichsdeutsch Germans took him and botched him, ruined his destiny. And the conclusion of his remarks on the case of Wagner are more or less a complaint that for 10 years, no German has felt compelled to study Nietzsche's writings or to rescue him from obscurity. A Dane, Georg Brandes, has done so. Or as Nietzsche says earlier in the chapter, he's found readers in France, in Russia, in Scandinavia, but not in Germany. And he predicts that when his revaluation of values is released, he says in about 2 years, which obviously that never happened, he says that it will be a world historical irony that he prefaces this revaluation with the case of Wagner. As Nietzsche says, quote, "It is part of my ambition to be considered a despiser of the Germans par excellence. End quote. So with that, Nietzsche sums up his career. We have an inkling of what he might have done if he had been allowed to continue for a few more years with his sanity, but as we all know, that was not his fate. Fate had it that he would be allowed, however, to sum up his career, to arrange it as he has done here in the form of a narrative on the eve of his own insanity. Few artists, few writers get the opportunity to finish their career with such a premeditated last word. So what we have in Ecce Homo is Nietzsche's understanding of what his career meant, the shape, the contours, the hero's journey that he embarked on, from the tremendous hope that spoke out of birth of tragedy when he was a young man in awe of Wagner, to his last productive years when he looked back at that period as a period of stagnation, a sickness that he had to wake up from. And in spite of the wild self-aggrandizement that laces the whole book, Nietzsche perhaps achieves something profound by writing in that spirit, because that spirit is precisely what the Germans lack. Honesty, right? Sincerity, passion, pride. He may come off at times as a raving egomaniac from our own moral standpoint, but Nietzsche was self-aware. He was willing to give us, his sincere readers, a peek behind the mask. And so Ecce Homo remains one of those really unique and fascinating works in the history of world literature. Analysis from the writer's own hand, literary criticism from the perspective of the author himself. Story of a whole career situated within a biography. And yet, we can't take our eyes off the fact it is still Nietzsche's story. It's not impartial. It's not objective. It's a work of art. It's an attempt to mold a life story. It's something which always has rough edges that don't fit, periods of boredom and apparent contradictions and so on and so forth, to take that and mold it into something beautiful and even inspiring. A life of ill health, of disappointments, of missteps, made into something bigger than that, perhaps a tragedy, a beautiful tragedy. And that's the performative element of Ecce Homo. Nietzsche is writing himself as a tragic figure, a figure who suffers but still affirms life, sanctifies it, and blesses it. Ecce Homo is Nietzsche's blessing on his life and his career, even those books from his middle period, that at one point he considered destroying. I'm very glad that instead he destroys nothing, he obscures nothing, he disparages really nothing from his life and his experience. It's all seen as necessary, everything is given its place, it's all a part of the story. Ecce Homo would never be my recommendation for a new reader of Nietzsche, but I would recommend it to everyone who has moved beyond that introductory phase, so to speak. Once you've read one or two of his books and you find an affinity with the man and his philosophy, Ecce Homo is a wonderful guide, explaining his whole chronology, situating each of his books with where he was in life, telling us what each book meant to him and for him. And I would agree with Kaufman, in many ways, it is a masterpiece. That's all for this week, everyone. Next time, we're going to talk about a single aphorism, one that I've wanted to talk about since the beginning of this podcast, but we weren't ready. Now we are. Hope you'll join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.